Here it is. Here's why I switched from my iPhone 14 Pro Max to my Galaxy S23 Ultra. Now, the Galaxy S23 Ultra and iPhone 14 Pro Max are two phones that have a lot in common, while also still having many differences that ultimately made me pick a side. They both have amazing hardware complemented with a signature look. Both have top tier displays that are smooth and filled with vibrance. Both have really good batteries that can last you all day even with heavy use. And both are at the top of their game for their respective companies. Even looking at them from an individual standpoint, there are some things that each phone was better at. The iPhone 14 Pro Max has a better and smoother ecosystem, more software updates which results in longevity, and arguably the best camera in the game. And the S23 Ultra had many valuable advantages as well. It has more features all across the board, it has the signature S Pen, and it has the best display that I've seen this year. So even though both of these phones had many things that were good, they both had their downsides when it came to many different things. And in this video, I will be looking at what each has to offer and why I ultimately chose the Galaxy S23 Ultra. So I will be comparing both phones based on 5 different categories, starting with display, battery, software, speakers, and last but not least, cameras. Now, looking at display, the Galaxy S23 Ultra has a 6.8-inch dynamic AMOLED display, and the iPhone 14 Pro Max has a 6.7-inch Super Retina XDR display. And I must say that both are very impressive. The combination of brightness, resolution, color, and sharpness makes each of them stand out. Whenever I was scrolling through my S23 Ultra and 14 Pro Max, everything looked nice. The S23 had this very sharp, fast feel, while the 14 Pro Max had this smooth, slower feel. And while I had no complaints about the overall feel of both phones, I would say that based on my personal preference, the S23 Ultra's fast and sharpness got me. Both phones have bezels that are extremely small. Even given a side-by-side comparison, it's really hard to rate which phone has a better screen real estate, but I will give it to the S23 Ultra since it only has a hole punch camera cutout instead of the iPhone's dynamic island that takes up significantly more space. Now, when it comes to brightness, the S23 Ultra is at 1750 nits and the 14 Pro Max is at 2000 nits, which is really good, but when comparing in real life, the 14 Pro Max was definitely the brightest. Another thing that I peeped was that the 14 Pro Max's whites were more rich, while the S23 Ultra gives off a more cool tone. Security was pretty much good on both phones, but I prefer the S23 Ultra. I will admit that the 14 Pro Max has better facial recognition, but the S23 Ultra had many more ways to unlock your phone, so I had to give it the slight edge. Now, the resolution and viewing experience of the S23 Ultra and 14 Pro Max is extremely comparable because both phones look phenomenal. Looking at them side by side though, something that I noticed was that the S23 Ultra has better colors, the sharpening was much more apparent, and the 14 Pro Max's resolution was a tiny bit worse. But it really isn't that deep since most of you guys and even I couldn't tell until I put them together. And I can pretty much say the same for gaming. The S23 Ultra handled gaming with a little less lag and looked better in terms of resolution, but again, both phones are damn near even. And the last thing that I wanted to point out within the displays is the size. The 14 Pro Max has a more rounded, slightly smaller display, while the S23 Ultra has a boxier yet bigger screen, which I really liked more when watching videos. And now, remember when I said that the S23 Ultra has more features? Well, the S Pen is a software and hardware addition that's pretty damn good. The responsiveness and palm rejection is great. It comes with many cool features, and it can be helpful whenever I'm signing contracts on my phone, but if I'm being honest, I don't really use it on the daily, and many can do without it, so based on my preference, I wouldn't say that it gives the S23 Ultra a leg up when compared to the 14 Pro Max. Now, the S23 Ultra has a 5000 mAh battery compared to the 14 Pro Max's 4300 mAh battery, and even though there might be a nicely sized difference on the spec sheet, both phones were able to give me all-day battery life. And to give you guys my battery disclaimer, I do not cut out corners when it comes to battery life. I always have 5G on, my always on display is always on, my brightness is always medium to high, and I do not use power saving mode. And with moderate to heavy usage, I'm usually getting over 8 to 9 hours of screen time a day on the S23 Ultra, and about 6 to 7 hours on my 14 Pro Max, and I only charge both phones when I go to sleep. And when it comes to battery, the only phone that I could feel possibly beat the S23 Ultra is the iPhone 13 Pro Max. I also tried heavy gaming on both phones. I pretty much got the same results, 5 to 6 hours of screen time before I had to charge it up again, and the game that I was playing was Asphalt 9. And if I could give you guys a quick estimate, I would say that my battery on the S23 Ultra is about 10 to 15% more when compared to the 14 Pro Max's battery, but if you want a battery that will last you all day, you really can't go wrong with either. Now, the last thing that I wanted to touch on when it came to battery was the charging. I used a 45 watt fast charger for my S23 Ultra and a 30 watt charger for my 14 Pro Max, and my phone was able to charge from 0 to 100% in under an hour with the S23 Ultra, and with with the 14 Pro Max, it will take a little longer. So if you find yourself in a situation where you forgot to charge your phone, by the time you get done showering or cleaning your house, both phones will definitely be over 70%, which is pretty good for me. Now looking at software, the S23 Ultra supports Android 13 and is also supported by One UI 5.1. The 14 Pro Max is on iOS 16, and so far in terms of smoothness and bugs, the S23 Ultra is easily winning in this category. But when it comes to software features and capabilities, it's genuinely personal preference. The iPhone has better social media integration, FaceTime, iMessage, and that very nice simplistic style. And the S23 Ultra has more features, more customization, and a more advanced feel. Some people love simplicity, some people love more freedom and features, and I personally love what each has to offer and the different experiences that they give. The always on display on the S23 Ultra was much more customizable than my 14 Pro Max. I like using social media on my 14 Pro Max more. I like answering emails and anything business related on my S23 Ultra, and I love the different built-in apps that each software had to offer. And in terms of software sleekness, the S23 Ultra was the clear winner. Samsung phones are typically very sharp when it comes to optimizing software, and Apple's iOS 16 did come with some bugs that are still getting ironed out. And I also loved how I felt like every bit of the S23 Ultra screen was used. There was no dead space, and I rarely ran into hiccups. And I also decided to test out some games on the S23 Ultra and 14 Pro Max. I played Asphalt 9, which is a game that can really test out the chip, and as you can see, both held up very well, and I didn't get any lags while playing. And now the final thing that I wanted to note was that the S23 Ultra will be getting 4 years worth of software upgrades, while the 14 Pro may be getting 5 to 6 years. So when it comes to longevity, the 14 Pro Max will last you longer when it comes to software. And now when it comes to speakers, both the S23 Ultra and 14 Pro Max had really good volume, good bass, and were well respected for what they could offer. But in terms of quality, the S23 Ultra speakers have more bass, the sound quality is better, and they're a little bit louder compared to the 14 Pro Max, which sounded slightly more muffled the more I turned up the volume. I also tested out the S23 Ultra and 14 Pro Max as my alarms, and I had no problems waking up from them. Both did a great job, and when it comes to phone calls and notifications, both phones are great. And right here, I'm going to give you guys an idea of how each speaker sounds. Now when it comes to camera, the Galaxy S23 Ultra has a 200 megapixel main camera, along with a 10 megapixel telephoto and periscope telephoto, and also a 12 megapixel ultra wide. And the iPhone 14 Pro Max has a 48 megapixel main camera, along with a 12 megapixel telephoto, ultra wide, and selfie camera. And I will admit, this is the one category that still makes me miss my iPhone at times. Now starting with zoom modes, both phones have a couple of different zoom modes. The S23 Ultra definitely had more, so I will give it the edge in that. The 14 Pro Max only goes up to 15 times zoom, while the S23 Ultra goes up to 100 times. And even when comparing the same zoom photos, I still thought the S23 Ultras were sharper. The shutter speed on the 14 Pro Max is so much better. I decided to test it out by shooting a moving car, and as you can see, the 14 Pro Max not only was able to shoot more shots, but it was also able to get them very clean, while the S23 Ultra took less shots. And next up, I want to show you guys how the cameras performed in different environments. Now looking at outside photos, the selfies on the S23 Ultra were good, but couldn't capture my skin tone well. I definitely prefer taking selfies on my 14 Pro Max. Also, the sharpness on my face could be too much sometimes on the S23 Ultra when compared to the 14 Pro Max, where the sharpening isn't overtaking a photo. And I also took some photos of random street objects, the sky, and different aspects of nature, and I can honestly say that both phones held up very well in these environments. And the 14 Pro Max gave me much more realistic photos, and the S23 Ultras look more processed. And taking a look at inside photos, both phones were able to capture everything nice, but again, the edge goes to my 14 Pro Max since my skin tone looked better, the blur was cleaner, and the sharpening was at a minimum. And now when it comes to shooting video, both phones were really great, but I will say that based on my use with each, the 14 Pro Max is much better. iPhones have always given off this clean look that looks like it could have been taken by a professional camera, while the S23 Ultra looks too sharp and processed. And the main reason that I do believe the S23 Ultra loses in this category is because when I take photos, you can tell that I took it with a smartphone, but with the iPhone 14 Pro Max, it's kind of harder to tell. Both phones had really good stabilization, so it was ultimately a tie for me. But again, the 14 Pro Max had better video quality, so again, I will give it the slight edge over the S23 Ultra. So all in all, I would definitely say that the S23 Ultra and 14 Pro Max have very good video cameras that will give you some consistently good shots. But if you're someone who wants to shoot content or you just want a very solid camera, the 14 Pro Max is much better. And also, here's some extra videos that I was able to get. So here's the final question. Why did I mainly choose the Galaxy S23 Ultra compared to my 14 Pro Max? Well, if I'm being honest, I just think that it's an overall better phone. It's really been a while now since the iPhone has given me some true excitement. When I picked up the S23 Ultra, I love that it has so many cool features. I love that it had insane power on the spec sheet, and it really gave me the feeling that Samsung is genuinely trying to make the best phone possible, unlike Apple. But there it is, you guys. My reasons for why I switched from the iPhone 14 Pro Max to the Galaxy S23 Ultra. Now comment down below. Which phone do you think is the best choice for you? And again, I want to thank you guys for watching today's video, and I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Peace.